This is the Mookse and the Gripes podcast. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor, lest Paul. Paul, how are you doing today?
Hey, Trevor. I'm doing pretty good. Excited to be here today and ready to go.
Yes, Paul, we have a special guest today. Someone that you have heard before, but this is the first time you're meeting them kind of in person. This is my brother Brian Berrett. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I should say welcome back, or way to reestablish your spot.
No, thank you. It's good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been. So for listeners who aren't aware, Brian and I actually started the Mookse and the Gripes podcast clear back in 2012 and would meet up every month or so to talk about books, and we would pick a book from the NYRB Classics catalog. Sometimes we would go through, like, what are their forthcoming releases that we're most excited about. And I can't remember how long we did it, but it got to where it was a little longer between shows. And then, it just kind of, we both got life things taken over. It might have been more me. I think I had another child and moving house and all of that kind of stuff. So, my apologies, but here we are again.
I can't believe it's been 10 years.
I know. It's a little bit mind blowing. And
well, as a longtime fan of the former iteration, I got to say it's pretty cool to be here with both of you guys. I listened faithfully all those times that you did it and was understanding but sad when it kind of faded away. So it's cool to have you both here.
Awesome.
But yeah, like I say, I often tease people, Brian, that you and I stopped the podcast, and I haven't spoken to you ever since you didn't like A Month in the Country as much as I did.
That really got under my skin.
Tell people it's been really awkward at family gatherings because I've chosen not to talk to you anymore.
Now that 10 years has passed, we're going to try and reconcile, though.
Yes, this should be hopefully a pleasant episode. It might be a little bit feisty, I guess, at times.
As long as we avoid jail car, I think everything will be fine.
Well, I'm excited to have you. And of course, Brian and I talk quite often about books and reading still. But today is a special episode, have you back, and have an opportunity to go over 3 books with Brian. Much like we did in an episode when we started last year with Francis Evangelista. We asked Brian to come on and basically talk to us about 3 books. We do have a few preliminaries, though, before we get there. If you can give me just a second, Brian, is that okay?
You bet.
All right. I just wondered. This is my big brother, so sometimes he might tell me, no, this is
All right.
how it is.
Get a virtual noogie.
Exactly.
So I want to thank a few new Patreon subscribers, Rebecca Hussey, Susan Dillon, and Mary Mulligan. They now have access to bonus episodes, and they have access to all of the episodes as they come out a few days early on Patreon. Thank you so much to each of you. We were going to record another bonus episode today, but circumstances are that just isn't going to work this weekend. But we'll get back on track and make sure that we get those bonus episodes coming out very regularly. But again, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
In other news, we have a book club, a summer book club, and the results. We talked about it in the last episode on summer reading. It went live on Twitter. It was in our newsletter. We had 4 books for listeners to vote on, which would be the summer book club. Here's the results, Paul. This was as close as I think a vote can really get, except
I was
for one
amazed.
book.
Mm-hmm. Which probably broke your heart a little bit.
A little bit. I mean, as we said, we would be unhappy if any of these lost and happy if any of them won. But yes, William Trevor's The Children of Dinmouth got only 14.5% of the vote, and that's a little bit farther behind the others than was maybe strictly necessary, folks. But but in third place, it starts getting much closer. This is Borges's Ficciones got 26.7% of the vote. And then second place was Speedboat, Renata Adler's Speedboat, with 27.8% of the vote. So really just a handful of votes separating those two books. But our winner with 31% of the vote is Willa Cather's A Lost Lady. And I don't know how much, Twitter folks and their powers of influence had to do with any of these things. A Lost Lady was in second or third place at the beginning, and then
Mm-hmm.
something happened. And it just
Yes.
took off and never relinquished that lead, even though all three of those books kept getting steady votes.
Yeah, there was a grassroots movement to kind of push it up, and it really worked. It was fun, though, to see different people voting and trying to raise votes for the other ones. So thanks, everybody, for participating. And it sounds like we have lots of people on board for the winner. A lot of people are excited about Willa Cather, so it'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I pulled it out. It's a short book. I didn't realize how short it was, but we will be getting with you on a schedule. Paul and I need to sit down and figure that out. It's not even really summer yet. We're recording this on June 11th. It feels like summer, but it's still spring officially by the calendar. So we'll get this a calendar figured out, and how best we can get input and all of that. We'll announce that on our next episode, and in other places too, like the newsletter and Twitter and such. So
Yeah.
all right. Anything else preliminary before we get back to Brian?
I don't think so. I think it's time to roll out the red carpet.
I'm excited. All right. Well, Brian,
Yes.
so I figure before we get into your three books, I always like to just know how people got into reading and what's going on now. And I will say, I credit you probably with a lot of my own reading. We shared a bedroom growing up, and I just always would come home or be going to bed, and you'd sit there and read while I fell asleep. And you know, go to the local tiny library, and you would confuse the librarians for asking for it. And what do you want? I want the book It, but which book?
Yes.
Who's on first?
And you probably got me reading Stephen King when I was way too young to really do that, but I appreciate that too. It was not a bad thing in my life. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about what reading means to you and books in general.
Now that's kind of funny because that's actually where I wanted to start. Was what my history was with reading. The first things I remember reading, it would be in grade school, and that little library that you're talking about had a collection of books that were probably, I don't know if they were from the 30s, 40s. I don't know. They were old by the time I was reading them in the 70s when I was in grade school. And they were biographies about early American statesmen, inventors, the George Washingtons, the Eli Whitneys, those kind of people. There was one on Betsy Ross, the classical, what you would think of as the statesman. And I don't know why I was reading those as a kid in grade school, but I loved them. I read all of them. And then a little later on, one of the first books I'd read too was Mrs. Frisbie and the Rats of Nim. And that was probably my first introduction to what would kind of be called fantasy. And I really, really enjoyed that. I think I read it a couple of times when I was in grade school. And then I distinctly remember this one in fifth grade. We read an excerpt from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and it blew me away. That was what I would say was my real introduction into that realm of kind of fantasy world, and that got me started because fantasy back then was closely tied with science fiction and horror, and that's what I spent most of my time reading when I was younger. And that's probably where Trevor picked up Stephen King, like he said. I read a lot of Stephen King back then. I put Stephen King away for a long time, and then maybe 10 years ago kind of picked him back up again, and I enjoyed both times reading him. I've always enjoyed reading a wide variety of books. So when I talk about, I can't say my three favorite books because I just don't have a three favorite books, but I can talk about three books that I really, really enjoyed. And when we get to that, I'll choose them out of different areas, different genres, if you will. One of my memories, too, that was really cool, Trevor, you might remember this. I was reading Paul Wilson's The Keep. Do you remember this, Trevor?
Yeah, even when you said you might remember this, I know what he's talking about.
It's so cool. The beginning of every chapter, it gives a date and a time. And for the year it's taking place in is during World War II. But the date, it gives a date, a time, and a year. And I remember flipping the last page of one chapter and getting to the first page of another chapter. And it gave a date, and I don't remember the date. It might have been like January 3rd at 12:15 a.m. And I thought, oh wow, that's weird because it's after midnight here. And I looked at my clock and it was 12:15, and I thought, oh man, we just missed the date. But the date had rolled, and it was the exact date and time of on the chapter is what I was reading, and it just sent a chill down my spine. So to get the little chill down my spine on top of reading the horror book was just a really, really cool experience. I loved it.
That is cool. And I think I remember you talking about that, and I had something similar. I'd be curious if Paul did. I was reading Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song about Gary Gilmore, and at the time when I was reading it, I can't remember if I was living in Provo, Utah, or maybe even a little bit in Salem, Utah, but that's where these murders took place, Spanish Fork, Provo, and I was getting my car fixed, and Norman Mailer's writing what he thinks of as journalism in a way, and a similar thing, he's writing about a specific address, and I kind of look around, and I'm like, holy cow, it wasn't a car repair place at the time, but that's where I'm at. I'm at that corner. I might not have been on the exact lot or whatever, but it maybe not quite as cool as yours, but I thought of you at that time. Have you ever had anything like that, Paul?
I was trying to think. I don't know if I've had anything quite like that. That's pretty cool stories. I mean, this is not nearly the same, but like I said, the time when I was listening to Wolf and White Van when we were driving across the country, and it started taking place in all these rural parts of Kansas, and it's all this creepy kind of unsettling stuff, and I look around as I'm driving, and that's exactly where I was. I mean, it's not anywhere near as precise as you guys' memories, but that was definitely one of my coolest reading experiences, where that synchronicity kind of happens when you don't expect it to. It kind of gives you the chills a little bit.
That's kind of cool how books, they delight us in so many ways, but even these unexpected, magical ways, you start to feel like maybe I'm in a book or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But what else have you got for us with that, Brian? And Paul, you should feel free to jump in with any particular questions too. I kind of want to give you guys a chance to chat, and we'll get to your three books here in just a second.
I'm curious as to what got Paul started, his early memories of reading, and what got him going.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a family-wide love of reading, which it sounds like to some degree might be the same as you guys. So yeah, I come from a family of lots of readers and teachers and things like that. So books were just always around. People were just always reading. And so I think a lot of it was that imprinting, and then of course my parents read to me a lot, but I've talked a little bit about it with Trevor in the past, but you mentioned C.S. Lewis. That was definitely one for me. And then J.R.R. Tolkien for me was probably even a bigger one with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, was just creating this whole world in my head where, we would be driving through the Colorado mountains and I would be kind of daydreaming out the window and picturing elves and hobbits out in the forest, that kind of thing. So that was definitely a big part. And then from there, I had a lot of time where I enjoyed fantasy, and then I made kind of the same transition it sounds like you made, where, and probably a lot of people make, where Stephen King is a little bit of that next step that you take. And like Trevor, I ended up reading him way too young. I remember reading It again, just like you mentioned, and getting to the point where there's a certain scene that takes place in a bathtub where somebody has, written the word "it" in blood on the side of the bathtub wall. And I remember reading that and kind of like on Friends where Joey puts the book in the freezer, because it's too scary. That's kind of the moment for me where I was like, okay, But at the same time, it's kind of that forbidden excitement that you have when you're reading a book when you're too young, and it kind of builds that love of, it's not just this boring, safe thing. There's all these exciting, forbidden worlds out there. So, yeah, I mean, that was a big part of it. And then that evolved into Trevor and I were on Palimpsest, which was a fun book forum, 10 or 15 years ago that we talk about a lot. And I would say that's kind of, if I had to divide it into maybe 3 sections, that's kind of where I started to get introduced to a lot of, I guess, what you would call literary fiction and more of translated fiction and YRB and the stuff that you guys like to talk about. So, if I had to break it down very simply, that would be kind of the way it's gone for me. So
Nice.
But
yeah.
Brian, you'll have to listen to our episode where we talk about our fantasy youth. You'll recognize so much of just. I mean, it must have just been a time period thing too. But Paul talking about his waterbed and having the bookshelves behind that you put on. Yeah.
Lots of Walden books and B. Dalton and all those, going in there and looking through all the Dragonlance Chronicles and all that stuff. And
it's interesting because a lot of the books would be the same because our access to books were limited. What was published and fed up to you in those types of bookstores. Yeah, I remember going to the bookstores and just staring at the wall, just, oh man, which one? It was fun.
I know. And I'd go up to the person at Walden Books and ask her, like, what's the latest one from R.A. Salvatore or somebody coming out? And that would be the only way you could kind of get some idea, or at least the only way I knew of, where she would say, well, looks like we might have one coming out next year, and then you just have to sit there and check back in.
The Dark Elf.
Yeah, exactly.
I love those.
I did too.
It is fun to just chat about these things, beyond getting into specific books. That's one of the reasons that I've always just enjoyed the podcasting with you two in particular. Is this is a conversation I think we'd have if we just sat together and enjoyed a meal or something like that. It's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
one of the genres I did not pick from, but I want to give mention to because it means so much to me is just what I would consider the classics, and when I think of that, I think of like Dickinson. I love Moby Dick, Les Miserables, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Kidnapped, all these authors, Treasure Island. I remember reading, I actually don't remember if it was Kidnapped or Treasure Island. It might have even been the sequel to Kidnapped. But I remember reading one chapter from that and getting done with that chapter and thinking that's probably the most perfect chapter I've ever read. It's just beautiful, fantastic. And one of my favorites back then too is of course the Count of Monte Cristo. And I just really, really enjoy those that I would consider the classics. And there are others that I have not enjoyed. I did War and Peace not too long ago and trudged my way through it. There were some good parts, but oh my gosh, that was too much for me. And I love a long book. If it's a good book, the longer the better. But that one's too long. There are a handful like that I did not enjoy. But I do love to go back to the classics and catch up on them periodically as well.
Yeah, it feels like when we talk, you usually have one of those in your back pocket that you're either about to read or reading. And I've tried to anticipate, what are Brian's 3 books going to be? Can I do it? And I thought Count of Monte Cristo might be one of them. So, but I'm glad you still brought it up.
It's an honorable mention.
There you go.
Nice. Any other honorable mentions you want to talk about before we get to your books?
No, I'm good. But I am curious. The classics, like I've described. I know. I think you and I read Moby Dick about the same time, Trevor, and then I believe you liked it. Do you have an affinity at all for what I'm terming as the classics, Brian's definition?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Moby Dick if I had to pick a favorite book of all time, that may be it, actually. Nice. I mean, I talk about getting blown away by a book and just amazed, because one of the things I like about Moby Dick is it's a classic which some people might in their mind think of as dusty and old-fashioned. And when I read that book, I could not believe how modern it felt and how many things it was doing that you see experimental authors of today doing that they get so much credit for. And Melville was, trying some of this stuff back then. So yeah, absolutely. And Trevor and I have both talked about, like, I have a huge love of Dickens too, just as far as a comfort read, and also just, something to sink into and just enjoy for a whole season, often if it's David Copperfield or one of the big ones. So yeah, classics are definitely one that I go back to all the time.
Awesome.
Yeah. Paul got me back into Dickens, actually, and reading more of his works again, and kind of going back when I thought maybe I'll never read another Charles Dickens book. I've enjoyed getting back into that world. So yeah, Paul's also one of those who often has a classic or two that he's lining up. The Brothers Karamazov is coming up, right?
It is. Yep. I'm trying to debate when I want to start it, but it'll definitely be before the end of the year. I'm looking forward to it. Get back
Nice.
into the Russians for a while.
Well, my apologies. I have a short schedule today. My wife's out of town, and I've got to take my kids to piano lessons this morning. She apologized when she realized she wasn't going to be here. They never have piano lessons on Saturday morning like this, but this is the one. So I do
No
want to make
problem.
sure that we get to you, Brian, into your books sooner than later. But we'll have to do this again because I can already tell this. We have a lot more to talk about and catch up on. But why don't you give us your first book you want to talk about?
Yeah, I will do that. First of all, I want to preface it with, why I read and probably why I read a wide variety of genres, which I'm sure you guys do as well. I read for two reasons. Number one, to learn. I am inquisitive by nature, so I love to learn new things. But number two, and carries the same amount of weight, is just for the sheer joy of reading, the joy of getting to go somewhere else while sitting on my couch, exploring new worlds, new concepts. I remember, and I'm gonna forget the quote, but someone asked Kingsley Amis why he reads. If I think they asked him if he reads for joy, and his response was something like, "Well, duh."
Mm-hmm.
I
and
think what you're talking, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is John Williams, the writer of Stoner and Butcher's Crossing and Augustus, which we talked about all three of those on the old
fantastic.
podcast. I think he said, "Do you read for pleasure?" And he said, "Yes, to read for any other reason is stupid," or something along those lines. Much more blunt, even.
I think Kingsley Amis had something too, something very similar. But the answer is yeah, duh. Of course, I read for pleasure, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But the ones I want to talk about, I read in my profession. There's a lot of working on yourself. I don't want to call it self improvement, but you read a lot of leadership books, and you do read a lot of what could be called self help books. But I read one a year or two ago. It's called Solve for Happy. And the author is Mo. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Gawdat, Gawdat. Mo is Mo. And it's a fascinating read because he's extremely successful in life. As I recall, he was pretty high up in Google, making just tons and tons of money, yet feeling very, very unhappy with his life. And I remember one specific thing in the book is, as he was searching for happiness, he thought, well, a Rolls Royce would make me happy. And so on a whim one night online, he bought two vintage Rolls Royces, thinking this is the key. This is it for me. And of course it didn't bring him happiness. And then he had a really, really tragic event take place in his life that rocked his world. And through that event, he figured out kind of an equation for him. That's why it's called Solve for Happy, on how to become happy. And he turned this tragic event into a way for him to ultimately become happy and have peace with life. And to me, it just really spoke to me. A lot of times when I read a book like that, it reminds me of things that I already know. It's like, oh yeah, that's a good reminder to think positively, or whatever the case might be. But he goes into some concepts that I haven't really contemplated before, and thoroughly enjoyed the book. I don't recommend books to people very often, self-help books, I should say. I'll recommend other books because to me it's like, here, Trevor, you need to read this book. You've got some
Thanks, Brian.
because I've had that happen to me, and I'm like, ah, great, thank you. But this is one that I gifted to my children with no pressure, saying this book, made me rethink some things about my life. You might enjoy it as well. In particular, it talks about how the brain works, and just very, very fascinating. It touches on a little bit of spiritual things, if you will, a little bit of theology. I believe he was I can't remember if he's a Christian or not. So I certainly don't remember what religion he might have belonged to, but I do remember that he believed in an afterlife, and that was a little bit of some of how he was solving for happy. But that's one that I always think back as one of my favorites anyway.
Interesting. You've never talked to me about that. Do I not need it, I suppose?
Yeah, I figured you this guy I know.
Solve for
Figures
happy.
You're already on a Friday night. You're online, shopping for vintage Rolls Royces anyway, so you don't need any help.
Right. You're waiting for that thing to happen to me,
That
and then you'll
level.
be like, Trevor, I've seen this happen before.
Hmm.
Oh no, that's cool and unexpected. That's certainly not one that I would have thought you were going to talk about because I don't even know that one. But
Yeah,
that
I didn't think we'd talked about it. And again, it's an area where I read a lot, and it's the one that's saying to me the most in the last several years in that area.
oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you have to tell me if you guess this second one. I mentioned biographies that I read as a kid, and I continue to enjoy biographies as an adult. And my favorite biographer would be Walter Isaacson. He's written a number of them, and I think I've read all of them but Kissinger, and I still need to read that one. I loved Steve Jobs. He wrote one recently called The Code Breakers, where they're talking about CRISPR and editing DNA just as you would edit a computer program. It's absolutely fascinating. But the one that I really liked the most was Leonardo da Vinci that he put out a few years ago.
Hmm.
I have a special place in my heart for history and for art, and I've traveled to Europe a handful of times and gone into the museums and have kind of studied Da Vinci a little bit on my own, and to have Isaacson write a book about Da Vinci and to use special paper and include a lot of the artwork in the book was just a real treat. I was sad when that book was over. And I loved Da Vinci because of the way his mind worked. I mean, he was all over the place, and why does this work? Sculptor, building, inventing, painting, you name it. He was involved in it. He would spend time just staring at water, watching the water swirl, and trying to figure out what made it do that. And then he would draw that and write about it. Just absolutely fascinating book.
Yeah, he has a fascinating mind. It's funny you mentioned him because last night, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that PBS show called Nova
Oh
that,
yeah,
that
I
comes
love
out.
Nova.
Yeah, every week they come up with a different topic, and the one my wife and I were watching last night was actually all about Da Vinci, and they were doing X-ray photos of the Mona Lisa and some of his other paintings, and talking about how he painted unlike any other painter, and just how different his mind was. And then they were also showing a lot of his journals where he would make all those amazing illustrations mixed in. And they were talking about how he, in addition to being an artist, like you said, and all these other things, he had like invented a tank clear back then
Yes.
for the, and then like almost like a self-driving car that was like half robot, and all these bridges that were just like groundbreaking at the time. So yeah, talk about a fascinating person. It's really
Yeah.
cool you mentioned that.
Yeah, my son's girlfriend is living in Italy right now, and she just sent a bunch of pictures. She lives in near Milan, and she went to the Leonardo da Vinci Museum, and
Oh
so
wow.
it's got his papers. It's got a lot of his drawings, like the tank and the flying machines where
Mm-hmm.
they've created them, and it's even got the museum. It's where the Last Supper is at. And so
Mm,
she sent pictures out. I was so jealous.
You've never
yeah.
been to Milan, huh?
I've
I
not been to
I
Milan.
have I have not either, but I guess I thought you would have in one of your trips just
No,
said
I
we're
haven't.
gonna take a day and drive to Milan or something.
And here's an interesting. My I've always loved art, in particular the Renaissance art. I love that period. And my wife and I were in visiting Italy a few years back, and we were in Florence. And my wife has always been, well, like, why do you have to see it? You can look it up online. It's the same thing. And we've had this discussion many times, not only with art, but with a place, with a location. You can look it up online and watch a video of it. And we walked into the museum, and there was Michelangelo's The David,
Mm.
the real one. And she stood there and looked at it for like 30 seconds without saying a thing. And then she turned and looked at me and said, I get it.
Oh yeah.
And that meant a lot to me. Uh,
You're you're not just dragging her around and
no,
an unwilling companion.
to have her say, "Oh, I get it," that meant a lot to me.
Mm.
But have either of you read Isaacson? I would assume some, a little bit, maybe.
I
Not
actually have
yet.
not.
Yeah,
No.
you would enjoy it. I'm
I
sure.
think you would too, Paul. I've read a few of them. I've read the Steve Jobs one. and I did read the Einstein
Oh,
book.
Einstein was fantastic.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought that might be one that you chose because we
Yeah,
talked about that
I
one
loved
several
that one.
times.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I gave my copy of Da Vinci to Dad
Oh, big mistake.
before I read it, and
Does that
so I
mean you'll never
haven't.
get it back?
No, he would. I actually think I gave it to him as a gift because it came.
Mm.
I think I pre-ordered that one, and I didn't realize how deluxe it was going to be as far
Oh,
as the way that they produced the book. And when it came, I thought, I actually want to give this to my dad, and I'll just get
Mhm.
another copy. And I actually haven't done that yet, so I have not read the Da Vinci one, but I do like his stuff.
yeah, it's a work of art in and of itself. It's gorgeous. Well, I know we're getting a little bit low on time here. I'll wrap up with Trevor. Will guess this one, just Brandon Sanderson, and I'm going to say the Stormlight Archive. Can't
Nice.
pick one single book. I love Trevor and I often talk about Brandon Sanderson. Don't understand how he can put out the content that he does and have it be as diverse and as interesting and as logical as it is. You know, he'll describe his magic systems using physics and logic, and when you get done reading, you think, "Oh, that should work. I should be able
I
to."
should be able to do that.
I really love the Stormlight Archive. The first five. The fifth one is it later this year? Is it coming out
No, he's writing that one now, so it's planned for
next year?
2023. Depending on how he finishes it up, it may slip into
It's the Wax
2024.
and Wayne that's later this year. That's right. But I love the themes in them. I particularly like Oathbringer. The character in Oathbringer was a cruel individual, and to me that it was all about redemption, and I loved it. Just a fantastic read.
Well, Paul, this is actually a Brandon Sanderson intervention. Brian and I put this together. We finally got you to read Agatha Christie a few weeks ago. It's now, what's it going to take to get you to change your life around for the better?
Yeah,
Just
I
kidding.
know. I feel like I might have been led into a bit of a trap here.
No, I bring up Brandon Sanderson quite often on the podcast. Probably every listener is like, I came for the other content. I know who Brandon Sanderson is. And I know some have tried him and have liked him of our listeners. And I know some have tried him and have not liked him, which I, totally get. It actually took me a few tries before I was like, wait a minute. I think I'm on the right wavelength right now. But yeah, very much a fan as well, and can't wait for the one that comes out in the fall, and for the book 5 of the Stormlight Archive. These huge books, but they're, like you say, they're very diverse. They're very rich. There's so much going on, and the thing that I think is so impressive is a lot of these are ideas that he's had for decades now,
Mm-hmm.
and he's so patient in planting the seeds so that he can surprise us at the right moments and have things come together. I'm reading a book that I'm actually enjoying, that Jade City that I told you, Paul, I was going to take on
Hmm.
vacation. I didn't finish it
Hmm.
because our vacation got a little crazy,
Right.
and so I stopped reading. Period. But it's a good book, but the author explains so many things that I'm like, oh, Brandon Sanderson wouldn't have revealed that until book 7. You know, why are we getting this on page 50?
That's funny. Yeah, I mean,
So,
you both mentioned that diversity, and I think I've talked about this a little bit. Although I have not read him personally, both of my sons, who are different ages, have both enjoyed his work, from The Evil Librarians for the younger one to the older one, who started to experiment with some of his more, I don't know if it's YA or maybe some of his earlier just adult fiction, but they've both really appreciated him. So every time you talk about him, I'm like, okay, I got to do it. So maybe Brian's extra push will be the one that kind of gets me ready.
Which one would
uh,
you start with, Trevor, if you were to read one and you hadn't read one yet?
people ask this all the time, and I don't know, because I did start reading Mistborn because people were reading it, but I was a little, not skeptical, but just like, oh, I don't really read fantasy anymore. And so I didn't give it a very good shot, and probably got 20 or 30 pages into it before I was like, oh, there's a lot of stuff I don't understand going on here. This just isn't my thing anymore. But it was when I started the Stormlight Archive, book 1, the Way of Kings. That's the one that really got me invested. Plus, I think it's just, by the time you get to the end of that one, there's, I didn't know what he was capable of doing with revelations and twists and plot developments and character developments, until the end of that, when I thought, whoa, you've been hiding this in plain sight the whole time, these things. And it's really fun because the characters don't know either. It didn't feel like a gimmick. It felt like, just beautiful storytelling. So that might be the one that I would recommend, even though it's the biggest, but I think that's probably his best. But
that's cool.
And Paul, I apologize for bringing Sanderson up.
Oh, no. Actually, I tease, but actually me not trying him is not due to lack of interest. Every time that he's brought up, I'm like, why haven't I read him yet? So I got to ask you, Brian, I know Brandon Sanderson earlier this year did like a crowdsourcing thing. And I think Trevor might have signed over the deed to his house for the next book. Did you end up donating to anything, or are you excited about those new books coming out?
I'm thrilled about it. Yeah. I signed up at the highest level I possibly could.
Nice.
And for two reasons. Number one, I'm really, really excited about what he writes. I read mostly everything he puts out. I love what he does, but also it was my way of saying, I like what you do. I'm going to support you. So it was a vote cast in with my money as well.
Yeah.
And he raised $45 million.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
If it weren't for your support, he would have been very discouraged.
I'm sure.
But I get it too. It's like, hey, you know what? I'm invested. I want to be able to show that I am, and not just, know. But,
no, absolutely. It's kind of like when I go to an author signing and you buy not only the book that they're there for, if it's one you love, but you try to buy as many of their backlist as you don't have. And like, you're in line waiting to have them sign them and everything. And it's not exactly just to get the autograph, but it's also just to kind of show them how much you appreciate everything they do. Cause I think being an author has to be a pretty lonely, thankless job at times. So I definitely get that, just a chance, however small, to show them how much they mean to you is important. So
agreed.
Yeah.
Oh, well, fellas, I could keep going for a lot longer. I'm actually enjoying Brian's outside. You can probably hear birds singing, in the background every once in a while. Which is,
it's very peaceful.
Not distracting. I think it's additive to the flavor of the show. So I'm having a very pleasant morning, but I do have to get those boys to their piano lessons. And so, unfortunately, need to wrap it up. But Brian, thanks so much for coming on. I'm glad you were, willing. Not that I thought you wouldn't be, but I've been looking forward to this, and I didn't want to presume that you would or anything like that. But it has been fun, and we definitely need to get you back soon.
I would enjoy that. It's been a pleasure, and it's nice to finally meet you, Paul, and put a face to the name.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. Like I said, I've been a fan of both of you guys for a long time, so it's really cool to be able to chat with both of you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, listeners, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We have another special guest actually joining us to talk another publisher, and that should be a lot of fun. In our newsletter, we talk a little bit about who that is and what's going on there. I'm not trying to tease, but I'm running out of time, so we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everybody.
See you guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mookse and the Gripes podcast. You can follow the Mookse and the Gripes and get show notes and book and film reviews at mookseandgripes.com. On Twitter, you can find Trevor at Mookse and Paul at BiblioPaul. You can also get information about future shows on our Patreon. If you'd like to donate to the show, anything and everything, even $1 a month, helps and is deeply appreciated. You can become a patron at patreon.com/Mookse. Until next time.